The morning Grant finally saw what he had thrown away, he was sitting in the kind of silence that only empty houses make. He had poured himself a cup of coffee. The expensive kind. The kind he used to say Miriam wasted money buying, before he remembered she was the one who always paid for it. He settled onto the leather couch, clicked on the television, and started flipping through channels the way men do, when they don't actually want to watch anything, just want the noise. He stopped when he saw her face. Miriam, his ex-wife, the woman he had handed divorce papers to 18 months ago, while her hands were still wet from doing the dishes. She was sitting across from a morning show host in a bright studio, wearing a blazer the color of deep water, her hair pinned back the way she used to do it on Sundays. She looked calm. She looked certain of herself. The chyron beneath her name read, Miriam Hayes, founder from Scratch Preserves, Small Business of the Year, Atlanta. Grant set his mug down so hard the coffee sloshed over the rim and pooled across the glass coffee table. He sat there staring at the screen, his chest tight, his jaw locked. On the television, the host was laughing at something Miriam said. Miriam was laughing too. Grant hadn't heard her laugh in years. The night he told her it was over, Miriam had been standing at the kitchen counter cutting strawberries. It was a Thursday in late October. The kitchen smelled like the pot of soup she had started that morning, before he came home from what he called a conference in Charlotte. But what she would later learn was a long weekend with someone named Tiffany, who worked in his company's Chicago office. She heard the front door close and felt the specific quality of his silence before she even turned around. Grant's silences had textures. She had learned them over 8 years of marriage the way you learn the sounds a house makes at night. Which creak means settle, which one means something is wrong. This silence meant something was very wrong. We need to talk, he said. She set down the paring knife. She turned around. He was loosening his tie, not looking at her, doing the thing men do when they are about to say something they know is cruel, and have decided to say it anyway. I've been thinking about this for a long time, he said. I'm not happy, Miriam. I haven't been happy, and I think we both know this hasn't been working. She stood very still. I filed the papers already, he said. My attorney says it's straightforward. There's not much to divide. There wasn't. That was the part that came back to her later, in the months after she left, the way he had said it so casually. Not much to divide. As though the years she had spent working 2 jobs to put him through his MBA, as though the lease she had co-signed when his credit was underwater, as though the dinners and the laundry, and the 1,000 invisible labors of keeping another person's life running smoothly. As though none of that had accumulated into anything worth splitting. Is there someone else? She asked. He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. She nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when you finally understand something you suspected for a long time but refused to believe. Okay, she said. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything. She picked the paring knife back up and finished cutting the strawberries, because the soup needed them, and she had started something, and she always finished what she started. Grant stood there for another minute, as though waiting for a reaction that would let him cast himself as the wronged party, then went upstairs to make phone calls. Miriam stood at the counter and let the tears fall silently into the colander. She had given this man 8 years. She had given him her 20s, which is the same as saying she had given him the version of herself that still had the most to offer, and the least protection against loss. She had given him loyalty she never second-guessed, patience she now recognized as a mistake, and every dollar she could spare during the years his ambition outpaced his income. When she went upstairs that night, she slept in the guest room. She did not sleep much. In the morning, she called her mother. Miriam grew up in Savannah, Georgia, the only daughter of a woman named Ruth, who worked 31 years as a school cafeteria manager and raised Miriam mostly alone after Miriam's father left when Miriam was 4. Ruth was a practical woman who expressed love through food. Through the specific and deliberate act of making something from raw ingredients and placing it in front of someone she cared about. When Miriam had a bad day as a child, Ruth made biscuits from scratch. When she graduated high school, Ruth made her grandmother's peach preserves and lined up 12 jars on the kitchen counter like a small golden celebration. Ruth had taught Miriam everything she knew about canning and preserving. How to sterilize jars, how to test the seal, how to read a recipe, and then trust yourself enough to deviate from it. It was not knowledge Miriam ever thought would amount to anything beyond keeping the tradition alive. It was just something they did together, she and her mother, in a small kitchen in Savannah, on summer afternoons when the peaches came in and the house smelled like something worth remembering. When Ruth passed 3 years before Miriam met Grant, She left behind a navy blue recipe tin filled with index cards written in her careful slanted handwriting. Recipes for blackberry jam, tomato chutney, spiced apple butter, fig preserves with orange peel. Each card had small notes in the margins. Less sugar if fruit is ripe. Add rosemary if you want something different. Always taste before you seal. Miriam had carried that tin through every apartment, every move, every change of address for 8 years of marriage. When she packed her things the week after signing the divorce papers, she left behind the furniture, the dishes, the wedding photo that had hung in the hallway. She did not leave behind the tin. It was the only thing she was certain of when she walked out. She moved back to Savannah. She had nowhere else to go. She was 34 years old, and she was sleeping in her childhood bedroom. Surrounded by the geography of a life she thought she had left behind. The posters were long gone, the furniture was different, but the light came through the window at the same angle it always had in the morning. And lying there in the quiet, Miriam felt like a version of herself she didn't recognize anymore. She had no job. She had left her position at the marketing firm in Atlanta to follow Grant when he relocated for his promotion. And the 2 years she had spent doing freelance work to accommodate his schedule had left her with a spotty resume and a gap. She didn't know how to explain without telling the whole story. She applied to 12 positions in the first 2 weeks. 7 didn't respond. 4 sent polite rejections. 1 invited her to an interview and then called to cancel the morning she was supposed to go in. She was rational enough to know that rejection was part of starting over. She was also human enough to lie on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes after that last call and let herself cry in a way she hadn't allowed since leaving Atlanta. Her mother's friend, a woman named Dot, who had known Ruth since they were both in their 20s, found her there. Dot had let herself in with the spare key. She checked on the house every few days, and she knocked on the bathroom door and then sat on the floor outside it and talked to Miriam through the wood until she heard the crying stop. "Come out and eat something," Dot said. "I made too much stew." Miriam came out. She ate the stew. She didn't say much. Dot didn't make her. After dinner, Dot looked at the navy blue tin sitting on the counter. Miriam had taken it out that morning without any particular purpose, just to hold something that had been her mother's, and said, "Your mama's preserves. Lord, I haven't had those since the church fair 3 years ago." "I haven't made them in a while," Miriam said. "Why not?" Dot asked. Miriam didn't have a good answer. The truth was that Grant had not been enthusiastic about the canning. He found the smell intrusive. He had once called it hobby stuff in front of his colleagues at a dinner party, and Miriam had smiled and said nothing, and quietly put the jars she had been planning to bring as hostess gifts back in the pantry before they left. "No reason, I guess," she said. That weekend, she drove to the farmer's market and bought peaches. She made the preserves on a Saturday afternoon with all the windows open. The house filled up with a smell so specific and so saturated with memory that she had to stop twice and press her palms flat on the counter and breathe until the feeling passed. This was what grief did sometimes. It arrived through the senses rather than the mind, bypassing whatever defenses you had built. The smell of peaches cooking in sugar was the smell of her mother. There was no separating them. She made 6 jars. She gave 2 to Dot. She put 1 aside for herself and took the other 3 to a neighbor's porch sale that a woman named Greta on the next street was organizing. The 3 jars sold in 11 minutes. Miriam stood there holding the cash, $9, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter. Something like direction. She went home and made 12 more jars. Those sold too, at the farmer's market the following Saturday, before she had finished setting up the table. The woman who bought the last jar asked if she had a website. Miriam went home and spent the weekend building one. She had never thought of herself as someone who started businesses. She had thought of herself as someone who was good at her job, good at keeping things organized, good at supporting the structures other people built. That was what 8 years with Grant had taught her to believe about herself, that she was support staff, not the main event. But the preserves were hers. The recipes were her mother's handwriting on index cards, worn soft at the edges from being handled. The modifications were her own. The cardamom she added to the peach jam after reading about it online at 2 in the morning. The smoked salt that changed the tomato chutney into something people couldn't stop talking about. Every jar was a decision she made alone and stood behind entirely. She named the company from scratch because that was what it was. Everything she was building now was from scratch. The first year was not easy. She was working out of the home kitchen, which meant navigating Georgia cottage food laws, which meant learning more about commercial licensing than she had ever expected to need to know. She called the county health department so many times she started recognizing the voice of the woman who answered. She read every food business blog she could find. She joined a small business group in Savannah and sat in the back at the first 3 meetings before she started talking. That was where she met Philip. He was not what she expected, which was the first thing she trusted about him. He was quiet in the same meetings where everyone else performed confidence. He ran a small woodworking operation out of a workshop behind his house. Custom furniture, mostly some cabinetry. And he had the particular kind of patience in his hands and his manner that comes from spending years working with material that does not hurry. They talked for the first time over bad coffee in a church fellowship hall during a break in a small business accounting workshop. He asked what she made. She told him. He asked if the cardamom peach was actually as good as the woman across the room had described it. She brought him a jar the following week. He texted her 4 days later to say he had eaten the entire thing in 3 days, and did she have any more? She did. They became friends the way adults sometimes do when they are both in the middle of rebuilding something, slowly, without fanfare, with a lot of practical conversation that was also somehow personal. He showed up at her market table one Saturday with a wooden display rack he had made to hold her jars, because he had noticed she was stacking them on a folding table covered with a dishcloth and thought she deserved better. He didn't make a thing of it. He just set it down and asked if it was the right height. Miriam looked at the rack. She looked at him. "How did you know what I needed?" she asked. He shrugged. "You were working with what you had. I had the wood." She thought about that for a long time afterward. 14 months after leaving Atlanta with nothing but her mother's tin and a single suitcase. From Scratch Preserves was selling at 7 farmers markets across coastal Georgia, stocking shelves in 4 specialty grocery stores, and filling online orders that Miriam processed in the evenings at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a spreadsheet she had built herself from scratch, which felt appropriate. The cardamom peach jam had been written up in a food column. A boutique hotel in Savannah had reached out about serving it at their weekend brunch. A journalist from an Atlanta business publication had emailed asking if she would speak with them for a feature on women-owned food businesses in the South. Miriam said yes. The feature ran in the spring. The photograph showed her standing in the kitchen, a jar of preserves in each hand, looking directly into the camera. The article talked about her background in marketing, her mother's recipes, the years she had spent learning every aspect of the business on her own. It mentioned the divorce in one sentence and did not linger on it, because Miriam had not allowed it to linger. That chapter was not the story. The rebuilding was the story. The article was picked up by a morning show producer in Atlanta. They called her on a Tuesday. She almost said no to the interview. She spent 3 days going back and forth. It wasn't the cameras or the visibility that made her hesitate. It was Atlanta. Going back to Atlanta meant passing through the geography of the years she had spent there, and she wasn't sure she was ready for how that would feel in her body. Not in her mind, which had mostly made its peace, but in the specific animal way that places hold memory. Philip found her sitting on the back porch at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night staring at the reply email she hadn't sent. He read it without being asked. He handed her phone back. "Are you scared?" he asked. "A little," she said. He nodded. "Okay. Is the fear telling you something true? Or is it just scared?" She thought about that. She thought about her mother, who had been afraid of plenty of things in her life, and done them anyway. She thought about the version of herself who had stayed quiet at dinner parties, while a man called her work hobby stuff. She typed yes, and hit send before she could think about it anymore. The morning the segment aired, Grant was sitting on the couch he had bought to replace the one from the marriage. Sleeker, more expensive, the kind of thing you buy to tell yourself a story about your new life. He had his coffee. He had flipped through channels and landed on the morning show, the way you land on things you weren't looking for. He saw her before he processed what he was seeing. Then he processed it. The host was saying something about resilience and small business growth, and Miriam was nodding and then saying something that made the studio audience laugh, and the graphic behind her said, "From Scratch Preserves. 400K in revenue, year 2. Grant put his mug down too hard. Coffee went across the table. $400,000. He stood up. He sat back down. He stood up again. He walked to the window and then walked back to the television and stood in front of it like he was going to argue with it. The woman he had told to sign papers while her hands were still wet. The woman he had called low maintenance as though that were a flaw. The woman whose jars of jam he had once described as clutter. $400,000. What happened next was not pride or happiness for her. Grant was not built for that. What moved through him was something smaller and uglier, the specific shame of a man who threw something away and watched someone else recognize its value. He drove to Savannah 3 weeks later. He told himself he was going for reasons he couldn't name clearly, which is what people tell themselves when they know exactly why they are going and don't want to face it. He found the market. He found her table. Miriam saw him from 10 feet away. Her face didn't change the way he expected it to. She didn't freeze or flush or reach for someone. She simply watched him walk toward her with an expression that was entirely calm, which was somehow worse than anything else she could have done. "Miriam," he said. "Grant." She said his name like it was a fact, not a greeting. He looked at the table. The jars were lined up on the wooden rack, the labels clean and professional, the small chalkboard sign with prices and flavors written in her handwriting. "This is impressive," he said. "Thank you. I watched the segment." She said nothing. He shifted his weight. "I've been thinking. About a lot of things. I think I made a mistake. I think we both know I made a mistake." He said it the way men say things they have rehearsed, smoothly, with the seams hidden. "I was wondering if we could talk, really talk, about whether there's anything still." "Grant," she said. He stopped. "I'm not interested in revisiting that conversation." She said it quietly. There was no heat in it, which meant there was no opening in it either. "I think you came here because you saw something on television and decided it meant something about you. But it doesn't. It's about me. It's what I built. You don't get a part of it because you're surprised by it." He opened his mouth. "I'm working," she said. She turned to the customer who had appeared at the end of the table. "Good morning. The cardamom peach is back this week if you were looking for it." Grant stood there for another moment. Then he walked away. He drove back to Atlanta the same day. He did not stop at any of the places he had planned to suggest they get coffee. He drove straight through in a silence that had a very different texture than the ones Miriam had once spent years learning to read. Philip had been at the market that morning. He had arrived with a new display piece he had built, a small tiered shelf that let the jars sit at different heights, and set it up at the far end of the table while Miriam was getting change from the cash box. He had seen Grant arrive. He had watched the exchange from a distance, not because he was possessive, but because he knew Miriam, and he knew this would cost her something even if she didn't show it. When Grant left, Philip walked over. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She rearranged 2 jars that didn't need rearranging. "I'm fine." He stood next to her in silence for a moment. Then he said, "The shelf looks good here, I think." "It does," she said. "It's perfect." She meant the shelf. She also didn't only mean the shelf. Philip understood that and didn't make her say it out loud. Later that evening, they sat on the same back porch, where he had found her 3 months earlier, staring at an unanswered email. The night air was warm and smelled like the neighbor's gardenias, and somewhere down the block, someone was grilling something that reminded Miriam of Sons when she was small. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah, when you came to the first market with the rack. Before any of this." She gestured vaguely between them. "Why did you do that?" He thought about it. "Because you were doing something real," he said. "Something that was actually yours. And you were doing it on a folding table with a dishcloth, and I thought that wasn't right. The thing deserved better than the setup you had." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. "Nobody ever said that to me before," she said. "That the thing I was doing deserved better. Usually people say I deserve better." "You do," he said, "but so does the work." She nodded slowly. She looked out at the dark yard, where her mother's fig tree still grew against the back fence. The one Ruth had planted when Miriam was 6. The one Miriam had driven past on the way from the airport when she came home and had to stop looking at because it undid her. "She would have loved all of this," Miriam said. "Not to him, exactly. But not to him." "Tell me about her," he said. So she did. The following spring, From Scratch Preserves moved out of the home kitchen and into a commercial production space on the east side of Savannah. Miriam signed the lease on a Tuesday morning and stood in the empty room afterward and looked at the stainless steel surfaces and the industrial shelving and the hood vents over the stoves and felt something move through her that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite triumph. It was something more specific than either, the feeling of a person who has built a floor beneath themselves board by board and is standing on it and can feel that it holds. She called Dot from the parking lot. "I signed it," she said when Dot picked up. There was a beat of silence, and then Dot made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sob. "Your mama is grinning so hard right now," she said. "I can feel it from here." Miriam leaned against her car in the parking lot, with one hand pressed over her eyes, laughing and crying at the same time, in a way that would have embarrassed her a few years ago, and now felt like the most honest thing she could do. Back in Atlanta, Grant was having a harder year than the one before it. The relationship that had ended his marriage had itself ended badly in a conversation he had not seen coming in a hotel bar in Charlotte, the same city where it had started, which felt like a detail a novelist would have removed for being too neat. He had made investments he had been too confident about and lost more than he wanted to think about. His apartment, the one with the expensive couch and the floor-to-ceiling windows he had once been proud of, was a sublease that was coming up for renewal at a rate he was no longer certain he could manage. He was not a bad man in the way that some men are bad, deliberately, with cruelty as a goal. He was bad in the more common way, careless, self-interested, unwilling to look at the things he didn't want to see until they were gone and he had no choice. He thought about Miriam sometimes. He thought about the way she had looked at him at the market, calm, closed, done. He thought about the 8 years she had stood beside him and how completely he had failed to understand what that was worth while he had it. He didn't reach out again. He wasn't sure what he would have said, and he was starting to understand that some things don't have a version where you get to explain yourself. The following October, Miriam and Philip got married in a small ceremony in the backyard of the house she had grown up in, beneath the fig tree her mother had planted. Dot cried through the entire thing. Philip's daughter from his first marriage stood at the end of the row of chairs and took photographs on her phone, and afterward pulled Miriam into a hug that lasted longer than Miriam expected and felt, somehow, exactly right. Miriam wore her mother's bracelet, a thin gold bangle Ruth had worn every day of her adult life, which Miriam had found in the navy blue tin when she finally sorted through it completely, tucked beneath the index cards in a small velvet pouch with a note in Ruth's handwriting. For when you're ready for it. She hadn't been ready for it for a long time, but she was ready now. During the reception, if you could call it that, which was just the porch and the yard and a table of food that Miriam and Dot and Philip's daughter had spent 2 days preparing together. Miriam stood for a moment alone at the edge of the yard. She looked at the fig tree, which was in the very last of its season, the leaves just beginning to turn. She thought about her mother. She thought about the kitchen in Savannah, and the kitchen in Atlanta, and the kitchen in the production space, where she now spent her mornings, surrounded by them of fruit and sugar, and something that was entirely hers. She thought about the version of herself who had signed divorce papers and walked out of a house in October with a tin recipe box and one suitcase and not a single certainty about what came next. That woman had kept going anyway. She had made something from scratch. She had kept the promise.